to this AHDB webinar, How, Where and When to Grow Maize. We've got quite a few people joining us tonight, so I'm hoping that we'll have lots of questions and discussion as we go through this webinar. I'm James Haig, Knowledge Exchange Manager with AHDB Dairy, and tonight I'm joined by our guest speakers, John Morgan from Creedy Associates, Adam Briggs from the NFU, and Mark Taylor from Catchment Sensitive Farming. Good evening to you all.
Good evening.
Before we make a start with tonight's topic, I'd like to just run through some housekeeping with you. Everyone is muted to avoid any sound interference, and we'll be closing the webinar no later than 8:30. This webinar will be recorded, so it'll be available for you to watch on YouTube, where you'll find previous recordings of other webinars too. For those of you that are listening to this recording on YouTube, please do hit subscribe for more AHDB digital channels, and also follow us on social media. There'll be an email sent out to everyone that's registered for this webinar with any resources that we might mention tonight, and I encourage you to complete the survey along with this to improve our future webinars. Steve, could you perhaps just click the slide on, please? And again, for anyone that perhaps wants to send questions in throughout the presentations, I'll be putting a few questions to our speakers once each one is finished, and also make sure that we've got some Q&A time at the end. Any questions you have can be submitted anonymously by clicking the orange arrow in the top right hand of your screen. I'd also like to bring to your attention that AHDB is asking you to have a greater say in how your levy is spent. And in April 2022, you'll get to have your say on the challenges that you'd like AHDB to focus on and the services that we'll deliver to you in the future. Shape the Future is not a vote on whether the levy is collected, but it will give you a chance to influence how the levy is spent on the things that matter to you. On the next slide, you'll see our home screen and that registration is now live. And the link is there. Just follow that on our homepage. For those of you that have registered to listen to this webinar, you'll be sent the link along with the follow-up email after today. Please do register to vote. It only takes a couple of minutes, so don't miss the opportunity to have your say. And if you've already registered, then help us to make sure we've got as many other businesses that are eligible to vote as possible by liking and sharing our social media posts and letting your friends know about the benefits you get from your levy. So on the next slide, whilst this is a cross-sector webinar, I thought it'd also be useful to mention the AHDB Farm Business Review Service, which is open to any cereals, beef, sheep and dairy farms across England. You've got until June 2022 to access this service, which provides one-to-one support from a consultant who will undertake a farm business review. The web address is up on the screen now, but we will send you the link for it in the follow-up email. But on to tonight's topic. This is the first of 3 webinars focusing on maize. Webinar 2 will look at growing maize for different markets. Webinar 3 will focus on harvesting, ensiling and feeding. But tonight we're going to discuss the how, where and when to grow maize. And to start us off, we've got the maize guru himself, John Morgan. John, if you can start the presentation.
Okay, thank you, James. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, so I've got a few slides to run through in the time allotted, so I'll keep moving. But I wanted to start off really with just setting out, that I'm a great fan of this great crop that is maize. I would argue it's part of the solution going forward in terms of climate change and environmental protection. It's a great crop for the farmers who grow it. I mean, the animals that eat it love it and perform well on it. It is being scientifically proven the best feedstock for digester biogas production. It's remarkably consistent. It's relatively low cost. Obviously, that's yield dependent, as many crops are. It's pretty easy to grow. Very wide harvest window, valuable starch volumes. I could go on and on. And I'll go on a little bit more to remind you it's very low agrochemical use. It's also a C4 crop, which makes it particularly efficient at converting sunlight and water into biomass. And believe it or not, it also has a relatively low carbon footprint, particularly when we start thinking about nitrogen requirements. So it's got a lot going for it. And we shouldn't lose sight of that, and sometimes we do. I'm kind of talking this evening with my kind of Creedy Associates hat on. I'm an independent consultant working with some colleagues down here in Devon. We have the honour of running the Maize Growers Association from the office here. So just a couple of lines on that, really. The MGA set up in 1988 by a group of farmers. There's about 550 members at the moment, most of whom are farmers. And really the role of the MGA is to kind of provide independent information and advice to those who've chosen to grow maize. We're not in the business of lobbying for maize, but we're in the business of trying to provide good independent information to those who choose to do so. So that, there's some really positives about maize, but unfortunately the reality is that maize has got some bad connections. And on the next slide, I've set those challenges out, and I'll try and just cover those very briefly as a starting point. So the two big issues really are that actually not directly linked to maize, and I'm really keen to make this point that the issue associated with maize often is compacted soils around harvest time. And that's not a maize related issue, that's a heavy machinery driving around on wet, weak soils issue. I'll try and address how we might tackle that with maize in a second. The second issue, again, not specifically related to maize, but often associated with it, is nutrient, I call it nutrient overload, nutrient leaching or nutrient runoff in the case of phosphorus. So both significant challenges are often put on maize's door, but I would argue are not directly related to maize. In terms of the compaction, you'll see on the next slide, really, the issue that we have with maize. So what you've got here is the annual rainfall broken down into months for just a standard area. It happens to be the southeast and central England. You've got the months along the bottom, and you've got the percentage, sorry, the millimetres of rains up the left-hand side. And you can see that, I should say this graph, in effect, is virtually the same right across the UK, with obviously some minor tweaks. The point I'm trying to make really is that harvesting maize when the soil is dry and the soil is strong results in very little soil compaction. The land can take heavy machinery pretty well, and the resultant water infiltration of the winter is good. But if we end up harvesting maize in October and November, highlighted by that second arrow, we've had a massive change in the water levels within the soil. Wet soil is weak. Wet soil can't take machinery, whether it's a maize harvester or a tractor feeding round bales, or a tractor harvesting sugar beet, or whatever it may be. Those wet soils can't take the weight, and as a consequence, we end up with soil compaction. The next slide, kind of series of photographs, really shows how seriously things can go wrong. So what you've got here is a spot. I always say when I show this slide, spot the maize field. You can see every trailer mark in that field. If you then move on, you can see the impact that if that water leaves the field, you end up with sediment-rich water running down roads. That water sadly doesn't stay in the roads. It ends up in a stream or a river, which is shown in the next slide. And that soil takes phosphorus with it. It takes agrochemical with it. It also blocks up sediment at the gravels at the bottom of the river. It's just a bad news issue. But I would argue it's not directly linked to maize, but it's linked to driving heavy kit round on wet, weak soil in the autumn. The next slide really highlights the second challenge that's often put on maize's door. So we're talking now about nutrient overload. And in effect, what we're doing is we've got a great opportunity with maize. It's a late drill spring crop to really effectively use organic manures. Unfortunately, that opportunity has historically, and probably still now in some cases, been abused, and we've overloaded fields with levels of organic manure that really do no good. And what happens then, and shown in the next slide, is that nutrient, the field can't hold that nutrient, and we end up with nutrient leaching, or in this case, the pond in my back garden, high levels of phosphorus in it, significant algal bloom. That pond's about 4 foot deep and is completely chocked with phosphorus-driven algal blooms. So that's the second challenge associated, it's often associated with maize. It's all about nutrient, over application of nutrient, nothing to do with maize. And again, I would make the point that it could apply to any case. It's just unfortunately it gets straddled with maize. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my slot is to talk about some of the core principles of growing maize. I'm going to start off talking about drilling and the importance of drilling at the right time of year to give you the best chance of harvesting maize in those dry conditions I talked about earlier on. Maize, a particular maize variety needs a set number of kind of heat units to go from a seed through to a mature cob. We call them Ontario heat units. The early maturing varieties of maize require less than the later ones. And heat units accumulate once the seed is planted in the field. They don't tend to accumulate much when it's still in the bag. So what we're really keen to try and get that early harvest and get maize harvested at the right time is to drill maize as soon as soil conditions and temperature allow. So the next slide kind of just gives me a reminder really of the kind of key elements of good soil for maize. It's not a great slide, so apologies. But first thing is you'll notice it doesn't have to be particularly fine, particularly near the surface. Sometimes we over-cultivate maize, which makes those soils less structurally stable and less resilient. But we do want some reasonably fine soils at or around where the seed is planted. And what we do most certainly want is uncompacted soil for those roots to develop into. Maize does not like compaction. It will really struggle to perform, and it's very easy to see where you've got compacted parts of the field. So it's important to get soil conditions right, and again, that's very much should dictate maize drilling. The second factor that to dictate maize drilling really is the soil temperature, and the next slide reminds me of one of the cheapest bits of kit you can get for your maize growing, which is a soil thermometer, about £7 or £8 from the garden centre. We're looking at, we know that maize germinates about 8 to 10 degrees C, and we know that if the forecast is good from that point onwards, really from the middle of April, we're into maize drilling time. There is always a concern about frost killing maize. Well, I can promise you, I've never seen a field killed with frost. The issues really develop if we end up with frost in June, when the growing tip is well above the ground. So it might be slow to come out of the ground, but maize drilled early is usually clocking up those heat units, which means it will be ready for harvest a little bit earlier. I'm not going to talk too much about seed rate, apart from saying, there are some circumstances when you might tweak that. If you might increase it if you know there are kind of particular pests around, or if it's not the best of seed beds you've created. But perhaps we'll talk a bit about seed rates next week when we're talking about maize for different uses, because seed rate will have an effect on starch levels and some of the other areas. Just wanted to show you now a slide showing the impact of drilling date on maize really at harvest time. So this is a trial relatively recent, 2020. We've got dry matter yield up on the left-hand side in tons per hectare, and we've got dry matter percentage along the bottom. In effect, that is the bottom, the lower axis is showing us the maturity of the maize. This trial actually was maize drilled at 2 different depths. Again, something we can talk about another day. But crucially, what I wanted to show really here is that the yield of those earlier treatments on the right-hand side of the graph was significantly more than those later drilled on the left, and the maturity, the dry matter of those earlier varieties, early treatments was higher than those that were drilled later. So yet again, and virtually every time we do this trial, when we drill maize as early as is practical and sensible because of the soil conditions, we end up with higher yields and earlier maturing maize. So it gives us that chance to get it harvested at the right time. If we then move on to the next kind of area I wanted to talk about really, which was choosing the right field, and we need to be a bit honest with here to make sure that we're growing maize in suitable fields. So I've got two questions really to ask. Is the field suitable to grow a late harvest arable crop? I'm harping back to my earlier comment here that it's all about the machinery being driven around in the autumn. And secondly, we want to be choosing, if the field is suitable, we want to choose the right maturity group. So at the MGA, we run a kind of what we call a site selector tool, which the summary table is in front of you now. And in effect, we score an individual field for all those various aspects. We're talking with the farmer about target harvest date and target drilling date, the altitude, the aspect, the characteristics to the soil, the annual rainfall, the gradient. We've recently added the proximity to the environmental features element because it's important that we recognize that if things start leaving our field, soil leaves our field, it tends to go somewhere it shouldn't. And then we also score where in the country it's grown. And we end up with a score that relates directly to the maturity groups of maize varieties out there. That's great. The challenge with that, though, is that sometimes those scores are higher than any of the varieties that we can offer members. And at that stage, we have the difficult question to say, well, is maize right for that field? Is that field is too risky? I have no problem with that conversation. It needs to be had because there is maize grown in fields that really it shouldn't be grown in. The options really revolve around alternative silages. So you've got whole crop silage as an option. You've got more grass silage as an option. Interestingly, one of the ones I quite like is you've got Italian ryegrass as an option, which can usually give you the consistency and quality of your maize. There is one final option with maize, which is growing maize under film, and the next slide is a quick reminder of that. So what we've got here is, it's a relatively old picture now, but it's a picture of maize being grown under degradable film. And what happens there is that film creates a bit of a cloche, heats the soil, speeds the maize up in its early development. It breaks down after about 6 to 8 weeks, and then the maize carries on as normal. The good news is that compostable film is being introduced, fully compostable film is being introduced this year. So we hopefully will lose the kind of negative microplastic issues that have been there in the past. But maize under film will shorten the growing season by 3 weeks. So it does, in effect, reduce the score of those fields, and that in some cases that might allow maize to be grown. So if we then move on and start talking about the next area, which is kind of nutrient management planning. Nutrient management planning with my kind of Creedy Associates hat on is something I spend a huge amount of time talking about. And increasingly discussing the new kind of the regulations of farming rules for water. That in fact have been around for 3.5 years, I'm reminded. April 2018 they came in fact nearly 4 years. And what they're really saying and what we should be doing as farmers and advisors really is trying to match the nutrient that a crop needs with that supplied by the soil and the manures and fertilizers we apply. So there's nothing new there, but it is actually a legal requirement now for you, and something we'll talk about for the next few slides. Whenever I produce a nutrient management plan, there are a couple of ground rules that need to be established and are sometimes forgotten. Every nutrient plan that's ever produced assumes that soil structure is not restricted. So just bear that in mind when you're thinking about nutrient planning. We need roots to be able to get within the whole rooting zone, and if that's restricted, that kind of can have an impact on the way we fertilize that plant. The other assumption, standard assumption, is that we look at soil pH, and that's important that we make sure nutrient availability is there, and that'll be the next slide. Right, conscious of time, we're going to move through some of these a little bit quicker. So nutrient management planning, the next slide talks you through the various steps of that process, which is soil sampling, crop recommendations, ideally analysing the manure, and then balancing that nutrient up with fertilizer. And then we usually turn to the AHDB RB209 fertilizer manual to give us an idea of crop requirements. The manual, I think you can move through those if you don't mind, that's great. And we'll move right through the next two to the table with the highlighted sectors on. So the RB209 manual is really good for phosphorus and potash requirements. The important point to note here really is that starter phosphate requirements are only really necessary when we've got relatively low soil phosphorus indices, so 0s, 1s and 2s. From then on, the manure and the soil will provide the phosphorus the crop needs. So one of the big things I'm talking to farmers about is trying to reduce the levels of phosphorus that we automatically apply. The other thing to point out really, just that second little bullet ring, which you'll see in a second, is that RB209 does assume a relatively low 12 tonne an acre yield. So if you're anticipating much higher yields than that, then you need to think about upping those phosphorus and potash levels. Next couple of slides, a bit of a joke really, talking really about the importance of analysing manures. You need a representative sample. This is not the recommended way to do that on the next slide, but it's getting that sample is quite a challenge. Moving on to talk about manures, it's really important that we incorporate manures as quickly as possible if we're going to get the full nitrogen element of those manures. So this slide shows that by 12 hours, a lot of the nitrogen as ammonia has been lost, and it's really important that when I talk about rapid with farmers, I mean rapidly within hours, not days. And this next photograph kind of gives you an idea of what I would love. I talk about rapid. Application rate of manure is really important. It's important to quantify the number of dung spreaders or slurry tankers used and multiply that up and get a good idea of what you've applied. And I would urge everyone really to have a good look and download this kind of Manure NPK software. Manure NPK is a free download that really will give you a great opportunity to look at the nutrient contribution from your manures. If we move on, really, the next thing I want to talk about is nitrogen, very briefly. Nitrogen is a big yield driver, as we all know. The unique thing with maize, though, is that maize nitrogen uptake ties in remarkably well with the breakdown of organic manure and soil organic matter. So there's a real opportunity to provide most, if not all, of the nitrogen from maize from current organic manure and previous organic matter. And that graph really highlights that. RB209 nitrogen recommendations, as shown in the next slide, are pretty rudimentary, and they don't really recognize enough, in my mind, the potential of soil organic matter. And I'm increasingly becoming a great fan of this testing for what we call additional available nitrogen, where the organic matter is actually incubated and the nitrogen it supplies is calculated. And what we're finding MJ-wise is that we don't need anything like the levels of nitrogen that perhaps we do for other crops. And that all ties in with that previous slide where linking nitrogen uptake with breakdown of organic matter. MJ-wise, we do have a nitrogen recommendation service our own. It's set out on the next slide, really, where we try to take account of variety, harvest date, targeted soil types, all the things we talked about earlier on when we were talking about risk assessment. And what we're trying to do here is to, in effect, fully recognize that soil organic matter and the impact of weather and maize agronomy on that likely release of nitrogen. What we found over the years is that use of that nitrogen predictor system generates far more variation in nitrogen recommendation and generally makes better use of the organic matter that we've got there. You'd be pleased to know, or hopefully not too pleased, my final slide is coming up now, and it's a slightly, well, very different subject, and it really highlights the importance of the final kind of issue, really. Maize really hates competition from anything else, especially in the first kind of 6-8 weeks of its existence. So this graph is really, it's an old graph. I've lost all notes of where it came from, but I know it came from an MGA trial done many years ago, and it's been the same ever since, that if we don't sort weed control out until 6 weeks after the maize is up and away, we end up with significantly lower yield than if we sort that weed competition out very early on. Unfortunately, because it's such an easy crop to grow, we tend to drill it, or sometimes we drill it, shut the gate, and are not back as quickly as we should. And the competition, the yield impact of that competition is significant. So I'm going to stop there. We've also got a chance to talk maize, or I've got a chance to talk a bit maize next week, and I'll bring some of the other issues in, but I'll stop there and allow others to have their say and be ready for questions as and when. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Just stay there for a couple of minutes. We've got a few questions just at the moment. One of the questions that came in, is there a third challenge with maize? In the length of time soil is left bare over winter, exposing it to rainfall and other degrading processes with a lack of soil cover or standing plant growth?
Yeah, there most certainly is. And I'm anticipating one of our other speakers this evening talking about some of the techniques that will reduce that bare soil. So yeah, I mean, we have a very strong commitment within the MGA that we don't leave any maize stubbles unmanaged over the winter months, either that undersowing, cover crops, following crops. But yeah, bare soils in the autumn, a lot of nutrient release, not bad, not good news at all.
Another question, John, then we'll perhaps move on. This one's about soil temperature, the compromise really between waiting for soil condition and temperature, and somebody waited for the soil temperature to get to where it should be this year, but felt that because they waited, they drilled it too late and compromised on yield. What would your advice be on that? Should we wait till that soil temperature is at optimum, or should we go if ground conditions allow?
It's a really good question, to be fair, and it's difficult to make a comment from afar. This year was an unusual year in that soil temperatures stayed much cooler than they would normally do. I mean, we normally hit that soil temperature in March, let alone April, and therefore soil temperature, to be honest, usually is not the issue. This year, I would have said, at the time, I would have said wait to the person, and I accept that will have had an impact, but I would be nervous about drilling maize into cold temperatures where the seed just sits there, potentially vulnerable to lots of other things. So I would have recommended later, but I can appreciate this year wasn't the best year.
Great. Thank you very much, John. We have got more questions, so I'll come back to those at the end when all speakers have given their presentations. But I'd like to now introduce Adam Briggs. Adam is the Northwest Environmental Advisor with the NFU, and you're just going to talk about the considerations for regulation and some support as well, Adam.
Yeah, thank you, James. First of all, thanks for inviting me along to speak tonight. Just as James said, I'm the Environment Advisor for the Northwest, and I cover everywhere from Longtown on the Scottish border down to Crewe, down in Cheshire. And I was asked tonight just to talk a little bit about some of the regulatory considerations around growing maize, but also to talk a little bit about where things are with respect to agricultural transition, the move away from BPS to a domestic agricultural policy. So the way I've approached this is, in terms of talking about the regulations, is what sort of regulations do come across my desk. So if a farmer's fallen foul of across compliance in their maize grower, what do they tend to focus on? And then also I'll talk a little bit about the farming rules for water and just touch on where things potentially are going with that. So in terms of cross compliance, that's the set of rules that underpin BPS, and it's how they penalise you if you fall foul of the rules. Now, obviously, with respect to cross compliance, farmers, if they're growing maize, will fall foul of things like not keeping NVZ records if they have to, their plant protection records, and also potentially things like footpath issues, where they'll plough across a footpath and not put a footpath back in. But in relation to ones that tend to be quite maize specific, the two that really come up, buffer strips does actually come up, but the two that really come up are the issue of providing minimum soil cover and also minimising soil erosion, probably for a lot of the reasons that have already been talked about. And it's all about you'll see 3 and 5% penalties applied to BPS applicants because you've had a lot of runoff. There's been no minimum soil cover on there, or they haven't in the RPA's in the RPA's view taken sufficient action to provide minimum cover or to address soil erosion issues. And obviously, going on from that, the other big regulatory issue in town, which has already been mentioned, is the farming rules for water. This was obviously launched in April 2018, and it was probably the softest of soft launches. So much so that the majority of farmers, when I was talking to about this 2 years later, didn't actually know they existed. But over the last year or so, we've really seen this starting to bite, and we've really seen a lot more focus placed upon the farm rules for water, and particularly the water environment. What I would say is that this isn't going to go away. Water quality is very much high on the agenda, not within agricultural transition, but within the general population at whole. We've seen a lot of stories regarding United Utilities pumping raw sewage into rivers and things like that. And we're seeing lots of headlines regarding no water bodies within England are in good ecological status. So the water environment is particularly important. So if anything, the regulations around this sort of area are only going to ramp up, and we need to make sure they actually do fit in with agricultural practice. The two which really I want to focus on, the first one was obviously Rule 1, which has already been talked about a little bit by John. And that's probably the one that caused the most concern last year. It basically says that you must plan in advance your nutrient applications to meet crop need, and must take action to minimise the risk of nutrients entering the water environment. Obviously, that led to a debate where particularly autumn applications of manure were not allowed, and then in response to that, in response to lobbying of the industry, a regulatory position statement was put in place which would allow those applications provided there were no other alternatives. That regulatory position statement is in place until the beginning of March. There's a lot of work going on in the background in relation to the interpretation of Rule 1. But at the end of the day, Rule 1 is there, and it says what it says. And it's basically that you need to take action to make sure that your nutrient applications meet the needs of the crop and don't pose a risk to the water environment. But that's very much a work in progress, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with that over the next few months. But there's a lot of work going on in the background on that. And the other one, particularly which relates to maize, is Rule 6. Whenever you do, these are some slides I borrowed from the Environment Agency for some, some meetings we've done with them right across the northwest, and whenever they talk about reasonable precautions to prevent soil runoff, they always seem to suggest that maize is a particular problem. So you need to take all reasonable precautions to prevent soil degradation that affects the water course, and that includes the application of manure and fertilizer, land management and cultivation practices, poaching by livestock, and particularly running mud off. And what I will say, the Environment Agency, they've provided quite a simple, straightforward 5-page document called the Rules for Farmers and Land Managers to Prevent Water Pollution. Some really practical, simple things you can do within there that will address particularly runoff. That's things, things such as undersown crops, that sort of thing. So I would, if you take anything from today, I would go and hunt that out and then just have that on your wall, and it'll help you address if you get an inspection. The final point on this, in relation to being the focus of the Environment Agency, they've employed 50 new inspectors nationwide, and they're really focusing on this. So it is something farmers need to be aware of, and they need to take action, that they're not actually falling foul of the farming rules for water. So there are obviously loads of other regulations that impact on people growing maize, but I've only got 20 minutes or so, so I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about where we are with respect to agricultural transition. So I've been in quite a lot of talks on this because farmers are very interested, particularly now as that 2021 is the first year, 2022 is 2021 is the first year where we see a reduction in farmers' BPS checks. So key thing there to remember is by BPS payment the majority of these schemes will become available. And the three components of the ELM scheme going forward are the Sustainable Farming Incentive, and I'll talk about that in quite a bit of detail because that's the one we know most about. There'll then be a second tier scheme, which is a local nature recovery scheme, which is aimed at delivering against locally identified nature objectives. And then there'll be something called the landscape recovery scheme, which is very much a step into the unknown, and that will be for permanent land use change to deliver against objectives. So if we talk about the Sustainable Farming Incentive in the first instance, that'll be launched. Can you go on the next slide, please? That'll be launched in 2022. Initially, it'll be only open to BPS applicants, but as time goes on, more people will be able to access SFI funding if they can deliver against the objectives identified within the scheme. So it's going to be initially a 3-year scheme, and once you go in, you'll get payments quarterly after your agreement starts. You can actually have it on land which is currently in stewardship agreements, as long as you're not getting paid for the same thing twice, and we'll just wait for the fine details on that. And as time goes on, you'll be able to add standards and add land and ambition to your application as more opportunities to make money from the land become available. What I would say is that you can increase the level of ambition, you can't decrease the level of ambition. So if you go and you put land in the scheme, you can't then take it out the scheme. Essentially, it's in the scheme for the duration of the 3 years. Importantly, what they have said is that private finance is allowed. So if you're in a situation where what you do in terms of SFI has a carbon benefit, you will be in a position to potentially sell that carbon. And the first three, well, the first 4 standards that are available to farmers will be an arable and horticultural soil standard, an improved grassland, an animal health and welfare standard. Hello?
Sorry to just interrupt. There's been a couple of occasions where your sound has just dropped out. Perhaps just take the camera off, and then it won't use so much broadband.
Right, okay.
Sorry about that.
That's no problem. Okay, so hopefully you can hear me all okay now. In terms of standards, by and large, the way to think of standards are they are just things you have on your farm. So it's arable and horticultural soil, it could be trees, it could be hedges, it could be dry stone walls or whatever. So standards essentially are just things you have on your farm. And the initial offer will be around arable and horticultural soils at an introductory and intermediate level, and the advanced opportunity will come further on. So I've taken the view that I don't think there'll be many moorland farmers here, so all I'm going to really do is talk about the arable and horticultural soils and the improved grassland soil standards. Next slide, please. So in terms of arable and horticultural soils, to get your £22 per hectare, what you need to do is test the soil once every 5 years, produce a soil management. It's up to you what that winter cover can actually be, but they say, obviously undersown crops, that sort of thing. Weedy stubbles is kind of what they're looking at, and you also need to add organic matter to the third of the land in the scheme every year. That only applies to land in the scheme. To get your intermediate payment, essentially you need to do all the introductory actions, but then 20% of the winter cover must be a certain multi-species green species, but they've given us no details on that. And if we have a look at the improved grassland standards, essentially similar to the arable standards, what they've said is that 95% of the land needs to have a green cover on to protect the soil. And to get the intermediate payment, essentially 15% of that green cover needs to be of a certain sort of mix. Again, we don't have the details of that. And if you look going forward, next slide, as time goes on, more and more standards will become available, which will allow you to actually stack different options on different parcels to get as much money as you possibly can. So as I say, I've done quite a lot of these sort of talks and just having to think about how I present this to farmers. And the way I found was the easiest way to do it was to create my own farm. So if you look on the next slide, this is my farm. I've called it Newcastle Farm. It's just recently been bought by some new investors who've got a bit of money and they're investing quite a bit of money in the farm. So hopefully it's got a bright future. So this is Newcastle Farm, and all these parcels here in red are my parcels of land. So for the purposes of this exercise, I've assumed that it's all just all an approved grassland farm. So in the first year, on the next slide, what I chose to do is to put all that land in green into the scheme. So the payments, I only get the payments for the land in green, but there are rules and requirements in relation to 95% soil cover, etc. They only apply to that land in green. And at a parcel level, next slide, essentially that's what it would be. So I'd get on this parcel here, this is Wilson Field, I get £28 a hectare. However, in year 2, if you go on the next one, because it's been so successful, what I've decided to do is I'll add those 4 extra parcels into the scheme because essentially, by and large, it's been very easy for me to adhere to the rules. And then at a field basis, I've decided again I want to increase my level of ambition. So I've gone from introductory to intermediate, but equally in year 2, more opportunities become available. So I can add the nutrient management standard onto my agreement. I can put the hedgerow standard in. I can put the integrated pest management standard in. Essentially, what it does is essentially it stacks the ability to make money from the scheme onto individual parcels within the land. And then in year 3, because it's been so easy, I've decided to go for the advanced. And then again, as time goes on, more and more standards become available. So I can put the water buffering standard in, or I can put the farmed up biodiversity standard in. By 2024, the local nature recovery scheme could become available. So in that sort of scenario, what I can do is I can actually then stack that on top of of my agreement to try and generate more money. The likelihood is the more options you put on, and the greater the ambition, the greater the impact that will potentially have on your on your core farming business. So it'll be a calculation you have to do to decide what actually works for you. So this is just a little bit of an example. So in year 1, that's not worth very much, 40, just over £1,000. But in year 2, by putting a bit more extra money in and increasing my level of ambition, I can get up to £3,000. But there's obviously a cost about establishing the herbal lay. The other thing to mention is that if you're already doing this is your part of your farming practice, and you can already meet them out doing anything extra, you can still get into the scheme. So that's just because you don't have to do something extra if you're already doing it to get into the scheme. If it's already currently your farming practice, you're all improved. And next slide. And then the other 2 schemes, they're very much in development. The first one is the local nature recovery scheme. That delivers against local nature priorities. It will be a competitive scheme, so you'll be able to apply to go in. That will be open to the majority of farmers, but every county is going to have to produce something called a local nature recovery strategy, and that will set the objectives in a particular area. So it'll be a set standard of objectives of payments and standards right across the country, but you'll have to pick the ones that essentially within, say, where I am in Lancashire, that the Lancashire Local Nature Recovery Strategy says they want you to do. So the more you tailor your application to the local objectives, the more likely you are to be able to be successful in the scheme. And the other thing that we want to do with that is foster cooperation. So we'll encourage farmers to get together and do applications that creates connectivity between habitats and things like that. That'll be piloted between now and 2024, with the scheme becoming fully available probably sometime after that. The biggest one, the biggest step in the union, is the landscape recovery scheme. That is for permanent land use changed associated with strategic objectives around things like climate change, flood management, afforestation, things like that. Permanent land use change, schemes of 20-year plus, between 500 and 5,000 hectares. There's no set payment for that. So essentially, it's going to be a negotiation between the provider of these habitats, this Landscape Recovery Initiative and DEFRA. And the other thing they talk about that is a blended finance model. So we're looking for the private sector to pay some of the money towards this, what I think is a bit of indication of the direction of travel they want to go for this whole area of environmental delivery. And finally, finally, just other schemes to be aware of. You're also going to have the lump sum exit scheme coming up. If you want to leave the industry and go and do something else, you'll be able to take your BPS up front, up to a maximum of about £100,000. More details on that coming in. There will be a new entrance scheme, which will be is looking at linking people who have land with people who want to farm from outside the industry. The slurry investment scheme is one that's caused a lot of interest, but there's very little information on it. It was supposed to be a standalone scheme, but now it's going to be incorporated at the Farm Investment Fund. And as I say, there is very little information on that, and we're just waiting for news on that. And the Farm Investment Fund, there's two parts of that. There's the Farm Transformational Fund and what's it called again? And the Equipment and Technology Fund. Again, that the first Equipment Technology Fund, that closed in January. It was very, very successful. It was oversubscribed. So I think going forward, more and more money will be probably shoved towards this sort of scheme to try and improve efficiency, because it does not only deliver for farm profitability, but it also delivers on things like carbon efficiency as well. And looking to the future, I was asked just to have a few thoughts on where I think things are going. In terms of income, I think, you know, we're going to see more and more money coming in from the private sector to try and deliver for the environment. You've also got utility companies with respect to maize will pay you to undersow your maize to try and improve water quality, address some of the problems around soil erosion. I think that will ramp up. I think there'll be more of a focus on efficiency. I think you'll see more grants available for things that will reduce your carbon footprint, because that delivers for both carbon footprint and also delivers for farm profitability. There's going to be a massive opportunity to engage in the carbon market, but at this moment in time, the carbon market it's been described as a bit of a wild west. So the best thing with that is probably to wait for a couple of years until it calms down and it's properly regulated. There are massive ambitions around tree planting. Not just at a national level where they want to plant 30,000 hectares a year, but every local council that you speak to has their own ambitions around tree planting. They're all looking to engage with farmers. It doesn't necessarily have to be land taken out of production. It could potentially be land which it could be tree planting within a productive landscape or on the periphery of productive landscape. The nature recovery agenda is going to kick on. That's not going anywhere, and there will be opportunities for some farmers to engage in that. And the other thing to mention is everybody always kind of looks to DEFRA for environmental schemes. There's something coming in called biodiversity net gain, which might be an option for some. And that's basically if a developer wants to develop some land, they need to provide a 10% gain on the biodiversity loss by doing that development. So again, that is another source of income. They're looking to try and deliver some of this nature recovery against a local nature recovery strategy. In terms of regulatory sort of where we're going in terms of regulations, I think there'll probably be quite a big focus on reducing the amount of inorganic fertilizer that is used by farmers, because that's seen as also good for carbon, but also helps improve efficiency on farm as well. I think you'll see a focus around energy use on farm as well, also potentially energy production. Particularly for maize, I think you'll see a focus on trying to minimise the amount of plastic used in maize production. We've already seen people trying to tax silage wrap that managed to get dropped, but I think that's the very much the direction of travel. And I think you'll see quite a lot of focus on air quality. A lot of the focus on air quality is around slurry, but as we've seen before, if you don't incorporate, you more quickly you get quite a big, you lose quite a bit of nitrogen into the atmosphere. So I think there'll be, once they've moved away from slurry, they'll probably move on to other sorts of things that put nitrogen in the atmosphere. So lots going on. It's just very much keep an eye on things, and certainly with respect to SFI, just try and design a scheme that works very much for you. And that's me.
Adam, that was really interesting. Lots of information to look out for that's coming down the line. Just for clarity, Adam, if you're talking about payments for green cover coming up, but if you can demonstrate that you've been providing green cover in the past, if you're already doing it, is there any sort of historic back payment that farmers can apply for, or is it just something coming up in the future?
No, it's something coming up in the future. So if you're doing it, that's fine. The complication may be is if you are doing it but you're getting paid under something like a stewardship agreement, then essentially they'll say, well, you can't get paid for doing the same thing priced by public money. Where it's not so clear is if, for the sake of argument, United Utilities are paying you money to put a green cover under your maize, and then could you then put that into the scheme because potentially they are paying you but the government aren't paying you? So it's those sorts of little technical details we're kind of waiting for. But certainly if you're getting paid via a stewardship scheme for establishing a green cover under a crop, that you wouldn't be able to get done, that wouldn't count towards your SFI. But if you're doing it not getting paid, that's entirely fine.
And another point of technicality, a green cover has got to establish, has it? If it's planted
Yes.
and fails,
if it planted and failed, it's not your fault. Again, that's probably the technicalities we don't actually know. What they do say is that an autumn sown crop can be a green cover, and it needs to be in place by the 1st of December. That doesn't mean if you sow it on the 30th of November, it counts as a green crop. You've got to have some actually grass growing there. So that's kind of what they say. If you grew it and failed, what they said they'd do in terms of inspections and penalties and things like that is they'll take a much more pragmatic approach. If they can see you've actually made the effort to do it and it's failed, certainly they won't penalise you. They might just say they're not going to pay you some of the money, but certainly they wouldn't penalise you. That's what they've actually said. Whereas in the past, certainly with CAP schemes, if you do something that doesn't actually work, not only do you lose your money, but you get a 5 or 10% penalty on top. They're moving away from that, which is positive news. But again, it's those sort of technical details we don't actually have, and we're probably expecting them in, I would have said, March sort of time. What I would say as well is originally they said it was going to open for applications in the spring. They've actually changed it now, and they say what they're going to do is they're going to open it after the BPS application windows closed, so people don't end up trying to do too many things at once.
Brilliant. Adam, thank you very much. We'll come back to you again once we've heard from Mark. But just to remind everyone, John mentioned in his presentation about the RB209 publication. Adam has also mentioned about nutrient planning. At AHDB, we have got the copies of RB209 printed, the hard copies. If anybody wants them, they're there, they're covered by the levy. Please let us know and we can get them sent out to you. But Mark, if I can pass over to you. Mark Taylor is from Catchment Sensitive Farming and is going to be looking about how to reduce the risk when growing maize. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. First slide, please. Yeah, so John and Adam have spoke some of the risks to do with growing maize, and none of us want to see this or to have this happen. There is the issue of public perception here, as well as all the legal and regulatory stuff that's already been spoken about. I'd also like to add in the fact of the damage to the soil structure, soil health, and the time and the effort that the farm's going to have to put in to sort of repair this and straighten this up, and then also the actual loss of soil off here, because you never seem to lose the horrible blue and yellow stuff. You only ever lose the nice stuff, the humus, the mineral and the organic fraction off the top of the soil. So the damage to this field here is pretty much long term, and it will not be cheap and effective to fix. But moving on from the negative side of things, what we've got in Countryside Stewardship are a number of options that can sort of really help prevent some of these issues associated with this. So the first one would be to put a buffer strip around a field where you're going to have maize. A buffer strip will, is just a grassy margin of variable widths, depending on what you choose to do, and it will prevent that soil running off. It will provide a bit of habitat and a bit of structure on those headlands, and just probably push the maize growing into the field, into the better parts of the field. It's all these options have pluses and minuses, and the one here is obviously a buffer strip is in place. If it's in place, it's in place, and it would have to stay in that field. So you have to think about your rotation, where you're going with your maize. And if you have a look at the next slide, Yeah, there we go. Nice little margin against the water course. It could be bigger, being pernickety, but that would be effective in stopping a lot and some of any runoff from that maize crop. But there's other options. So cover cropping is a specific option for maize, whereby you use an early harvest. The maize has to be harvested early, as in September, and then you establish a cover crop afterwards. Now, I imagine down south this is much easier than further up north where I am. However, there's a payment there and an encouragement to do this. You know, so get your maize off and get straight in on top of it. And if you look at the next slide, you can see a field here where I'd suggest it's been totally successful. You've got a full ground cover of something green, which is taking up nutrient, it's supporting soil health, it's providing some habitat, and it's providing some soil structure, probably even restructuring the soil, any issues in this. And that's going to protect that soil surface over winter until it's ploughed up and the next crop takes its place. So next one, please. The SW6 cover crops option has been queried, and if you use it in an undersowing situation, it is eligible. So for the payment, and if you're undersowing, then this to me is a bit of a no-brainer. If there's a negative, and I don't think there is, you need to retain it through till the early spring when you destroy it and then plant your next crop in after that. But again, next picture, please. There's an awful lot of work being done on this now, and this isn't the novel technology it used to be, but you get a green cover under the growing crop, which is taking up nutrient, providing structure, providing some stability to the soil at harvest time, and providing habitat again throughout the winter. So again, this is a massive benefit, and there's a payment on it for doing this. So these sort of cover crop after or undersowing options really are, I think, good choices in growing maize. And next slide, please. If maize doesn't work, and you shouldn't be growing maize, the whole crop cereal option has just received an increase in its payment rate, and it has to be a spring sown crop, and then you have to retain the stubble. But I don't see those as issues at all, really, and it would fit into a farm whole cropping already or sowing maize as well. I think the payment rate is what's driving a lot of this, and I really can't see why you wouldn't do this. Next slide, please. So what you get is a sort of limited choice of herbicides. You take an early harvest and then you leave the stubble. So the stubble is going to provide some ground cover. It's going to provide habitat again, and any rubbish growing on it will be taking up nutrient and supporting the soil health. And so all these options are available anywhere through Countryside Stewardship. And I think if anybody's growing maize, they should be looking at any of these. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. Comment that's come in from the audience, just the great news recognising the option to undersow maize and refine the technique. So that's good news. A couple of questions as well that have come in. Can I claim for a buffer strip and a cover crop on the same land?
On the same land, but of course you'd have to manage the area. So the buffer strip would have an area around the perimeter of the field, and then the cover crop in the field would be a smaller area than the total field size, if that makes sense. You can't overlap them.
Okay, and another question, Mark. If somebody's in stewardship already, have they to take the land out of stewardship before they can take part in the new schemes?
Do you mean the elm schemes,
Yes,
the SFI and stuff?
I think so. Yes, must I
If
take
you're
land out?
already if you're already in a stewardship scheme, you're in a scheme. Now, there's a couple of things here. If you've got any more land and you wanted to pick up some of these options, you could, but you have to do it on fresh land if you like. There's not already in a scheme. And then regarding SFI and the elm schemes, my understanding is that if you're in a countryside stewardship, I think this year onwards, you're able to leave that and enter one of the elm schemes if you want to, without reclaim.
Right. Okay. Great. Thanks, Mark. If I could just ask John and Adam to come back on screen. Question for John, I think it was for. John, as I understand it, maize has a low nitrogen requirement. How can you keep the nitrogen where it is?
I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question, so let's just try and break it down. The reason why I say it has a low nitrogen requirement, in fact, it's not so much it's got a low requirement, but that it's very, very good at making good use of soil organic matter nitrogen. So nitrogen that's mineralized through the warm summer months, that nitrogen is released at a time when the maize is taking it up. And as a result, there's less of a need for additional inorganic nitrogen. How do we hold on to it? Well, the maize crop will hold on to it when it's growing through June, July, and August. It takes up a lot of nitrogen. It uses nitrogen, but subsequent to that, so September, October, the undersown crops that Mark's talked about will do a fantastic job of soaking up the nutrient that is released from probably 1st of September onwards. And that's why we're most certainly of the view in continuous maize situations that undersown maize is better than aftersown maize. So what I mean by that is maize, crops established after maize harvest won't take up the nutrient that an undersown crop will.
Okay, another question, John, about bird control in maize. What are your tips? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the observant ones I'm actually will kind of notice that I put a slide up earlier on about maize drilled at different depths. And one of the techniques that we're looking at is to drill, believe it or not, drill maize below the length of a crow's beak, because if they can't get at it, then the maize has a chance to get away. So drilling depth is one option. And you'll notice, you might pick up from that slide that drilling it at 10 centimeters rather than 5 didn't impact on yield significantly. And therefore that's one option. We continue to look at other options to try and deter birds. I suppose I should say, for those who are not aware, the seed dressings that have traditionally been useful to deter birds are being withdrawn. So we're looking at kind of more organic options, chili powder, coffee, various things that might actually just put birds off for that vital kind of month. So there's lots going on. The only advice I can give at the moment would be probably to drill it deeper, to reduce the chance of the birds taking your seed, and they hopefully go to someone else's, but that's not particularly nice for the other people.
And when you say deeper, what are we looking at?
Kind of 10 centimeters, so what's that, 5 inches, that kind of depth, which tends to be, you know, it's quite a bit deeper than we would typically drill maize. So it is slower to emerge, and there will be some seed loss, but it does make it too low for the birds to find those seeds.
Okay. Adam, Mark, probably one for you both to take on. Are there any issues arising from continuous maize which receives AD waste from digester plants? Thinking about accumulation of nutrients or long-term soil structure issue?
I want to say something on that as well, please, James, but I'll let the others go first.
To be fair, I would have thought that was more one for John than myself. If
Okay.
I'm brutally honest.
Yeah, I passed to John on that one, but yeah, values of soil testing and nutrient analysis.
John, over to you then.
Okay, so that's another, going back to my presentation really, there's nothing kind of fundamentally wrong with continuous maize, particularly if it's interspersed with an undersown cover crop. The nutrient issues associated with digestate are nutrient management issues, and Mark hinted if the field is soil tested regularly and the digestate applied based on crop requirements, there should be no buildup of nutrient. The challenge with any organic manure, including digestate, is that it's a compound. It's got nitrogen, phosphate, potash, sulfur, and a lot of other things as well in between. So it's really important to balance probably just to keep an eye on all of those various nutrients to ensure we're not building up soil indices. In terms of soil structure, back to my earlier point really, machines driving on dry soil don't cause issues. Machines driving on wet soils, whether it's maize or anything else, will cause problems. So it's important to be driving when the fields can take the machinery.
John, if I can just stay with you, just in terms of machinery operations. Another question that's come in is regarding min-till maize. Can we do it? We've always created a graded seed bed. So what are your thoughts on min-till maize?
Yeah, it's a really good question again. The answer is yes. There's no reason at all why min-till, strip-till, min-till shouldn't work with maize. But I'll bring you back to a comment I made earlier on. Maize really struggles with soil compaction or compacted soils. So it's vital with any min-till system, and particularly with maize, that you're min-tilling into a well-structured soil. And that again is all about timeliness, avoiding compaction the previous year so that you've got a well-structured soil this year. But there's no reason at all why min-till shouldn't work. There's an increasing interest in it, and people are doing it quite successfully, but it's all about maintaining good soil structure.
Yeah, can I just make a comment there as well? In terms of the advanced advanced standard, that's what all the talk was about, that min-till is going to be within the advanced arable and arable soil standard. So, you know, it's worth investigating, because that's going to be one of the key elements if you want to get that higher rate of payment. And if it works for productivity and it works and get a bit of money for it, why wouldn't you do it?
Okay. Right. Buffer strips. How can we use buffer strips better? I think there was another question on buffer strips, but just perhaps for Mark and Adam, how can we use buffer strips better? Where should we be putting them?
Buffer strips can serve a number of functions in a number of places. Shallow valleys in fields where you've got a sort of runoff channel, you can use that as like an infield grass strip against any wildlife habitat feature such as a hedgerow, stone wall even. Buffer strip is going to add value to that feature. So with a hedgerow and then a buffer strip, that's an increased amount of habitat. Against watercourses, I'm afraid more is more, but the wider option pays a lot more, and that's going to move your machinery and your farming away from the wet, shaded, cold areas against watercourses under trees. That's going to benefit the habitat feature, the environmental feature, and will ease your farming through straightening off meanders, through getting you out into the warmer, better parts of the more productive parts of the field.
I mean, I'll just comment as well. Probably one of the big sort of opportunities around strips and things like that, and also corners as well, but particularly strips, is certainly with the local nature recovery element of Elm, there's a real focus on connectivity. So what they don't want is, like, you've got a really good habitat there, then just nothing, and then a really good habitat there. So potentially want to use people with strips that allow like wildlife corridors and things like that. That's potentially where they can really fit in. And as time goes on, you know, if that strip can not only offer you a bit of money for your biodiversity sort of thing that you're getting via the scheme, but also connect a habitat. It's likely worth a hell of a lot more than just a strip on its own. And as well as, you know, it can provide opportunities, things like tree planting as well. And there's a frustration I have around trees that are seen as an either or. You can have trees or productive land, but there's loads of opportunities of having trees in the farmed landscape. And I think certainly a lot of the debate gets stuck in this issue of you want to take land out of production to plant in trees, and I think there's loads of opportunities for having trees within a productive landscape. And chatting to a farmer, he says, you know, I've just put loads of trees in my corners because I don't really turn them. It's the wrong shape for me. So it's the periphery where I think a lot of certainly the biodiversity alongside productivity can really be found.
Just jump on the back of that as well. And I hadn't thought of trees, thank you, Adam, but with the right management, if you're interested, you can always add some more botanicals to a margin mix. So rather than just having a functional plain grass one, if you have a floral one and manage it correctly, you can get some real benefit out of that, and really supporting pollinators and invertebrates through it as well.
Probably finally, if it stops ending up nutrients ending up in the water, it's going to be a real benefit to you. That's a massive one, because the whole direction of this water quality discussion, you know, we can't ignore that. So if you put buffer strips in, it protects the water adjacent to your farm. It's going to be a massive benefit to you.
And you've just preempted or answered a question that's also come in, Adam. Should we be considering proximity to watercourses in our cropping decisions? I think that's a unanimous yes.
Yes.
Right,
James, can I just say a little bit about the buffer strip one? So my only concern with buffer strips that only go along the margins of fields is that if the water has built up sufficient speed before that point, it travels across those buffers pretty easily. So I personally am quite keen about buffer strip cultivation strips within the field, just to slow that, to reduce the fetch and slow the speed of water. Now, on the face of it, it sounds shocking to be breaking up some big workable fields, but it most certainly will achieve the result of reducing loss to the surface water. So in-field strips, buffer strips, I think are a good thing to think about.
Okay. Do the panel feel that there are likely to be more regulations on phosphate? There are challenges with accumulation depending on cropping decisions. So thoughts from the panel on phosphate regulations? John, shall I come to you first?
Yeah, okay. So phosphorus is a big issue, particularly on the more intensive dairy, pig and poultry farms. They're importing far more phosphorus than they're exporting in their milk and meat. The good news is there's lots of opportunities to reduce that surplus by being smart with concentrate phosphorus levels and the like, and then also by exporting manures to arable farms where the feeds were grown initially. So there's lots of opportunities to improve phosphorus situation. In terms of regulation, you know, the kind of regulations almost there. There are water standards for phosphorus levels in water, and it's the challenge with a lot of things is how heavily they'll be policed as time goes on. So again, I think it is an issue. There's lots of opportunities, and the regulation I would suggest is already there to look if it needs to.
I mean, I'll comment on that as well. I completely agree. I think the regulation is there. In the northwest, there are some land with very, very high phosphate levels just because of the way it's farmed, and I do think the regulation is there. But we do need to try and find a way to deal with it, because the farce of it is, you know, if you kind of get to a situation where you can't put slurry on, essentially you end up putting more organic fertilizer on at different times in the year, which is kind of completely contrary to what DEFRA are trying to drive at. They've got a big drive to try and reduce the amount of organic fertilizer you put on land, because not only is it seen as good for the environment, it also reduces your carbon footprint. So we need to find a way to navigate through these sorts of challenges, and maybe that's just looking at, it's risk as much as anything, which is the key thing, risk to a water course, which needs to be addressed, because just as you can't put slurry on, it's kind of completely counterproductive to a lot of everything else they're trying to achieve.
I do think a lot of the stuff's already there through farming rules and NVZs. That's there already, but I do fear, and I almost worry that there's a lot of basic nutrient management planning needs to be done whereby people are still applying slurries manures to fields at 4s, 5s indexes where you know it's going to run straight off. And I even know a case where people are buying phosphate fertilizers as well. And we really need to start trusting this soil, to believe in the soil analysis and believing our instincts that more is not more.
If ever there was a year to ease off buying fertilizer, it's definitely the year, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've also got a question. What are the prospects for strip till? Before the panel answer this, John, could you just explain to those people that are on the webinar what strip till is, please?
Yeah, I can have a go. Yeah, so strip tillage is a technique where, as the name suggests, a strip of ground is cultivated into which the maize is sown. That strip can be can vary in widths, but the non-cultivated strip would be left uncultivated. It may well have a crop growing, a cover crop going on it. And there's lots of reasons for doing it. I mean, it does most certainly maintain soil structure and therefore reduces surface loss. It will, if there's a green crop there, it will hold on to nutrient that might otherwise be leached. It's lower cost. So there's lots of reasons why it's looked at, and it's been very effective, and most certainly something that more and more people are looking at.
What are your thoughts on it, John? What do you think the prospects for it are?
Prospects are really good. Again, unfortunately, like a repeating record, it depends very much what the soil structure is like when you start doing it, because ploughing of any field sorts out compaction within the plough depth. So if you've compacted a field previously through bad, or not bad, but driving machines when the soils aren't able to take it, then ploughing is a way of removing that compaction, getting yourself back to square one. If you don't have poor soil structure when you start, then strip till, like min till, will work very effectively.
Yeah. Anything to add from Adam and Mark?
Not from me, no.
Okay. No. And probably one last question, and I'm nervous to ask it. In terms of growing maize under plastic, we've heard probably two sides of it this evening. It helps establishment, but also we're going to be facing regulatory pressures to reduce the use of it. Does growing maize under film mean that we can perhaps grow it further north as we go up the country? What are people's thoughts? Where it gets, I'm guessing, sort of temperature getting colder.
Shall I kick off, James? So,
yep.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that most maize under film is grown in what we would call marginal areas of the country, far west, further north, and that, in effect, it achieves a warmer soil when the maize seed is drilled, and therefore it artificially shortens the growing season, and you end up being able to grow maize where you wouldn't otherwise be. The primary issue with film negative, which I fully recognise, and is historically the lack of total degradation of the film. So even though it might not be visual, the microplastics are still there. I've yet to see and yet to have the confidence that the compostable plastic that has been introduced this year will be fully compostable and will still achieve the result. So yeah, so film does what it says it will do. Historically, it's come with issues in terms of long-term breakdown. The promise is that the compostable plastic will not have those issues, and therefore I don't really have a problem with farmers choosing to do that if they choose to do so.
I mean, I'll comment as well. I mean, like I say, I personally don't have a problem. The issue is I think plastic's quite a toxic brand with society, and that's kind of where a lot of this drives come. You saw what happened with plastic straws. You see what's happened with shopping bags as well. But obviously, as useful, I think the key thing will be to try and find something that's more palatable to the general public, a non-sort of plastic alternative, which will do the job. and allow people to keep on growing maize. But it's not just maize. I mean, I deal with quite a few horticultural growers, and they've got the same issue with their packaging. They're getting told to try and different sorts of plant-based packaging, cellulose packaging, but
Yeah.
you know, when you've got a lot of water in there, it just dissolves as you're trying to pack your broccoli, which is not really what you want. So I don't think it's a problem that's going to go away. It does need to be addressed, but I think the key will be just finding something that does the job, but is more acceptable in the environment. That'll be my view.
Yep. And I think that's a really good point to leave on, that, you know, everything that we do has to be acceptable to the environment, has to be acceptable to the consumer, because at the end of the day, they are our you know, our customer. So thanks very much to you all for this evening. I think we've managed to get through all the questions. We've had some great discussion, and thank you very much to the three of you for your input. So if we can just skip on the slide, just to thank everybody for attending this evening. You should get a follow-up email with the link to the recording of this webinar and links to the resources featured on this screen. If you'd like a copy of the Growing and Feeding Maize Manual, then please contact publications at ahdb.org.uk and we'll get one sent out to you. And the same goes for the RB209 publications as well. On the next slide, just keep a lookout on our social media platforms for any upcoming webinars that we've got. And don't forget to register for the next 2 webinars in this May series, which are on Thursday the 10th and Thursday the 17th. Next week, we're looking at growing maize for different markets. And the following week, we're looking at harvesting, ensiling and feeding maize. Both of those webinars are starting at 7 p.m. again. Please also make sure that you've registered your business to vote in the Shape the Future. So thanks for joining us on this webinar. I hope that you found it useful. I want to reassure you that AHDB continues to be here for you, and your local teams will be more than happy to hear from you if there's anything that we can do to help further. Thanks very much, everyone, and goodbye.